In the meantime, Ezio, having no time for such things and only chafing against the delay, brooded over the maps and notes he had brought with him, and vainly tried to glean intelligence on the Templars' movements in the area and in the region south and east of Greece. At one celebration in his honor, he made the acquaintance of a Dalmatian princess and had a dalliance with her, but it was no more than that, a dalliance, and his heart remained as isolated as it had been for so long. He had ceased, he told himself, to look for love. A home of his own, a real home, and a family, these held no place in the life of an assassin mentor. Ezio had read something, dimly understood, of the life of his remote forebear in the Brotherhood, Altaïr Ibn-La'Ahad. He had paid dearly for having a family. And even though Ezio's own father had managed it, he too had paid a bitter price in the end. But at last, not too soon for the impatient Ezio, the winds and the seas abated, and were replaced with the fine weather of spring. Mamoun had made all the arrangements for his onward passage to Crete, and the same ship would take him farther, as far as Cyprus. This vessel was a warship, a four-masted cogger, the Cutaiba, with one of its lower decks armed with a line of 10 cannon on each side, and more guns in emplacements in the hull, fore and aft. In addition to lateen sails, she was square-rigged, European style, on the mainmast and mizzenmast, and there was an oar deck below the cannon, 30 oars to a side. Chained to one of them was the Berber captain Ezio had tangled with on the Anan. "You will be free from the need to defend yourself on this ship, Effendi," Mamoun told Ezio. "I admire it. It has something of the European design about it." "Our Sultan Bayezid admires much that is gracious and useful in your culture," replied Mamoun. "We can learn much from each other if we try." Ezio nodded. "The Cutaiba carries our Athens envoy to a conference at Nicosia, and will dock at Larnaca in 20 days. The captain stops at Heraklion, only to take on water and supplies," he paused, "and I have something for you." They were seated drinking sharbat in Mamoun's office in the port. The Turk now turned to a huge, iron-bound chest that stood against the far wall, taking from it a map. "This is precious, as all maps are, but it is a special gift from me to you. It is a map of Cyprus drawn up by Piri himself. You will have time there." He held up his hands as Ezio began to object, as politely as he could. The farther east you travelled, the less urgency there seemed to be about time. "I know. I am aware of your impatience to reach Syria, but the Kogge will only take you so far, and we must arrange your onward transport from Larnaca. Fear not. You saved the Anan. We will be suitably grateful for that act. No one will get you to your destination faster than we." Ezio unrolled the map and examined it. It was a fine, detailed work. He thought that if he was indeed obliged to spend time on that island, he knew from clues he had already picked up in his father's archives that Cyprus was not without interest to the assassins in the history of their eternal struggle with the Templars, and that it could well be that there he would find clues that might help him. He would make good use of his time at Cyprus, but he hoped he would not have to tarry there long, effectively controlled as it was by the Templars, whatever appearances might be to the contrary. But it was to be a longer journey than anyone might have anticipated. Hardly had they set sail from Crete after their brief landing at Heraklion, a matter of no more than 3 days, than the winds began to rage again. Southerly this time, fierce and warm still from their long journey out of North Africa. The Cutaiba battled them bravely, but by degrees she was beaten back north up the Aegean, fighting her retreat through the tangle of islands of the Dodecanese. It was a week before the storms abated, not before claiming the lives of 5 mariners and an uncounted number of galley prisoners who drowned at their oars. At last the ship put into Chios for a refit. Ezio dried his gear and cleaned his equipment of any rust. The metal of his special weapons had never shown the least sign of tarnish in all the years he had had them. One of the many mysterious properties they had, which Leonardo had attempted to explain to him in vain. 3 precious months had been lost before the Kutaiba at last limped into the harbour of Larnaca. The envoy, who'd lost 20 pounds on the voyage through seasickness and vomiting, and who'd long since missed his conference, made immediate arrangements to travel back to Athens by the most direct route, travelling overland as far as he could. Ezio wasted no time in looking up the Larnaca agent, Bekir, whose name Mamoun had given him. Bekir was welcoming and even deferential. Ezio Auditore da Firenze, the famous rescuer of ships. He was already the talk of Larnaca. Auditore Effendi's name was on every lip. Ah, the question of passage to Tortosa, the nearest mainland port to Masyaf in Syria. Yes, of course. Arrangements will be placed in hand immediately, this very day. If the Effendi will be patient while the necessary wheels are set in motion, the best possible accommodations will be at his disposal. The lodgings arranged for Ezio were indeed splendid. A large, light apartment in a mansion built on a low hill above the town, overlooking it and the crystal sea beyond. But after too much time had passed, his patience grew thin. "It is the Venetians," explained the agent. "They tolerate an Ottoman presence here, but only in a civil sense. The military authorities are, regrettably, wary of us. I feel that," the man lowered his voice, "were it not for the reputation of our Sultan, Bayezid, whose authority stretches far and whose power is mighty, we might not be tolerated at all." He brightened. "Perhaps you could help in your own cause, Effendi." "In what way?" "I thought perhaps that, as a Venetian yourself—" Ezio bit his lip. But he was not a man to let time hang idly. While he waited, he studied Pirideus's map, and something drew him, something half-remembered that he had read, to hire a horse and ride down the coast to Limassol. Once there, he found himself wandering through the motte and bailey of the deserted castle of Guy de Lusignan, built during the Crusades, but currently neglected, like some once useful tool whose owner has forgotten to throw it away. As he walked through its empty, draughty corridors and looked at the wild flowers growing in its courtyards and the budleia that clung to its crumbling ramparts, memories, at least they seemed to be memories, prompted him to explore more deeply, to delve into the bowels of the keep and explore the vaults beneath it. There, shrouded in crepuscular gloom, he found the desolate and empty remains of what had undoubtedly once been a vast archive. His lonely footfalls echoed in the dark labyrinth of rotting, empty shelving. The only occupants were scuttling rats, whose eyes glinted suspiciously as they scurried away, giving him slanting, evil looks, and they could tell him nothing. He made as thorough a search as he could, but not a clue of what had been there remained. Disheartened, he returned to the sunshine. The presence of a library there reminded him of the library he sought. Something was prompting him, though. He could not put his finger on what it was. Stubbornly, he remained at the castle 2 days. Townspeople looked oddly at the dark, grizzled stranger who roamed their ruin. Then Ezio remembered. 3 centuries earlier, Cyprus had been the property of the Templars. 6. The Venetian authorities, or someone behind them, were clearly blocking his onward passage. This became clear to him as soon as he had confronted them. Florentines and Venetians might have been rivals, might have looked down on one another, but they shared the same country and the same language. That cut no ice at all with the governor there. Domenico Garofoli was like a pencil, long, thin, and grey. His black robes, exquisitely cut in the most costly damask, nevertheless hung from him like rags from a scarecrow. The heavy gold rings set with rubies and pearls clattered loosely on his bony fingers. His lips were so narrow that you could hardly say they were there at all, and when his mouth was closed you could not see where it was in his face. He was, of course, unfailingly polite. Ezio's action had done much to warm Ottoman-Venetian relations in the region, but he was clearly unwilling to do anything. The situation on the mainland eastward, beyond the coastal towns that clung to the shore of the Mediterranean like the fingertips of a man hanging from a precipice, was fraught with danger. The Ottoman presence in Syria was mighty, and further Ottoman ambitions westward much feared. Any mission not sanctioned by official diplomacy could trigger an international incident of the most dire proportions. That, at least, was Garofoli's excuse. There was no way Ezio was going to find allies among his countrymen on Crete. Ezio listened and listened, sitting politely, with his hands on his knees, as the governor droned on in a desiccated voice, and decided to take matters into his own hands. That very evening he made his first reconnaissance of the docks. There were ships aplenty moored there, dhows from Araby and North Africa bumping against Venetian roqueforts, galleys and caravels. A Dutch fleet looked promising, and there were men working aboard loading thick bales of silk under an armed guard. But once Ezio had recognized the cargo, he knew that the fleet would be homeward bound, not outward, and he needed a ship sailing east. He wandered farther, keeping to the shadows, a dark form still as lithe and fluid as a cat, but his search yielded him nothing. Several days and nights passed in reconnoitering. He always took all his essential equipment with him in case he struck it lucky and could get away there and then. But each foray ended with the same result. Ezio's notoriety had marked him, and he had to go to some lengths to keep his identity secret. But even when he succeeded, he found that no ship's master was headed in precisely the direction he wanted, or that they were, for some reason, unwilling to take him, no matter how big the bribe offered. He considered returning to Bekir, but resisted this in the end. Bekir already knew too much about his intentions. The fifth night found him again at the docks. Fewer ships by then, and apart from the night watchmen and their crews who passed seldom, their lanterns swinging on long poles and their swords or truncheons always at the ready, no one else was about. Ezio made his way to the most distant quaysides, where smaller vessels were tied up. The distance to the mainland was not that great. Perhaps if he could acquire some boat of his own, he might be able to sail the 75 leagues or so alone. Cautiously, he set foot on a wooden jetty, its black boards shiny with seawater, along which 5 small single-sail dhows were ranked, fishing boats from the smell of them, but sturdy, and 2 of them had all their gear stowed aboard, as far as Ezio could see. Then the hairs on the back of his neck pricked. Too late. Before Ezio had time to turn, he was knocked flat on his face by the force of the weight of the man who'd thrown himself on him. Big man, that much Ezio could sense. Very big. He was pinning Ezio down by the size of his body alone. It was like struggling under a massive, muscular eiderdown. Ezio wrenched his right hand free so that he could unleash his hidden blade, but his wrist was instantly grasped in a grip of iron. He noticed out of the corner of his eye that the hand that held his wrist was cuffed with a manacle from which 2 broken chain links dangled. Gathering his strength, Ezio twisted violently and suddenly to his left, digging his left elbow hard into a part of the eiderdown that he hoped was tender. He was fortunate. The man pinioning him grunted in pain and relaxed his hold a fraction. It was enough. Following through, Ezio heaved with his left shoulder and managed to roll the body off his own. Like lightning, he was up on one knee, his left hand on the man's throat, his right poised to strike. Ezio's moment of triumph was short. The man knocked his right hand away, the iron manacle on the man's left hand, similarly adorned with a couple of chain links, striking Ezio's wrist painfully despite the protection of the hidden blade's harness, and Ezio found his left wrist now caught in another vice-like grip, which slowly but inexorably forced his hold on the man's throat to weaken. They rolled over, each trying to get the better of the other, putting in blows where they could, but although his assailant was bulky, he was quick, and Ezio's blade never found a mark. At last they separated and stood, grunting, out of breath, hunched, facing each other. The man was unarmed, but the iron manacles could do a lot of damage used as weapons. Then, from a short distance away, there was a flash of light from a lantern and a cry.
"The watch!"
said the man.
"Down!"
Instinctively, Ezio followed the big man's lead as they dived into the nearest dhow, flattening themselves in its bottom. Ezio's mind was racing. In the flash of light from the lantern, he had seen the man's face and recognized him. How could it be? But there was no time to worry about that. They could hear the footfalls of the watch scurrying toward the jetty.
"They saw us, may Allah blind them," said the man. "Better see to them. You ready?"
Astonished, Ezio nodded mutely in the dark.
"I'll finish you off once we've seen to them," the man added.
I wouldn't bet on it. There was no time for any more talk, as the 5 men of the watch were already upon them. Fortunately, they hesitated before throwing themselves down into the dark well of the boat, where Ezio and his unlikely ally now stood, and contented themselves with standing on the jetty, waving their weapons and yelling threats. The big man regarded them.
"Easy meat," he said, "but we'd better take them now before they attract too much attention."
In reply, Ezio braced himself, crouched, and leapt up to the jetty, catching its edge and hauling himself onto it in one, these days, not quite fluid movement. In the moment it took him to catch his breath, 3 of the watch were upon him, bludgeoning him to the ground with heavy truncheons, while a 4th man approached, swirling a short but wicked-looking sword. He raised it for the coup de grace, but in that instant he was lifted bodily by the scruff of the neck from behind and hurled, howling, backward and upward, to land with a sickening crash a long way farther down the jetty, where he lay, moaning, several of his bones broken. At the moment that Ezio's 3 other attackers were distracted by this, Ezio sprang to his feet and snapped out his hidden blade, slicing down 2 of them in 2 quick, efficient strokes. Meanwhile, the big man was struggling with the lamp-holder, another giant, who had thrown his pole aside and drawn a massive Damascus, which he waved threateningly over the head of his opponent, who held him in a wrestler's body grip. Ezio could see that at any moment the thick blade would come down square into the broad back of the big man. He cursed himself for not having strapped on his gun, but it was too late for that. He grabbed a fallen truncheon, and shoving the remaining watchman aside with his elbow, hurled it at the head of the lanternman. His aim had, thank God, been true. The truncheon struck the lanternman square between the eyes, and he staggered back, falling to his knees. Then Ezio felt a sharp pain in his side. The surviving member of the watch had drawn a dagger and stabbed him. He sank, and before his world went black, he saw the big man running toward him. 7. When Ezio came to, he was lying on his back somewhere, and the world was rocking beneath him. Not violently, but steadily. It was almost comforting. He stayed where he was for a moment, eyes still closed, feeling a breeze on his face, not quite wanting to come back to whatever reality was waiting to confront him, smelling the sea air. The sea air? He opened his eyes. The sun was up, and he could see an unbroken expanse of blue sky. Then a dark shape came between the sky and him, a head and shoulders, a concerned face looking down at him.
"You're back. Good,"
said the big man. Ezio started to sit up, and as he did so the pain from his wound hit him. He groaned and put a hand to his side. He felt bandages.
"Flesh wound, not too deep, nothing to make a fuss about."
Ezio raised himself. His next thought was for his kit. He looked around swiftly. There it was, neatly stashed in his leather bag, and it looked untouched.
"Where are we?"
he asked.
"Where do you think? At sea?"
Painfully, Ezio stood and looked about him. They were in one of the fishing dhows, cutting steadily through the water, the sail above his head fat with wind. He turned and could see Larnaca, a speck on the coastline of Cyprus, on the distant horizon behind them.
"What happened?" "You saved my life, I saved yours."
"Why?"
"It's the law. Pity, though. After what you did to me, you had it coming."
The man had had his back to him, working the tiller, but now he turned to Ezio. For the first time Ezio had a good look at his face, and recognized him instantly.
You wrecked my ships, curse you. I'd been stalking the Anan for days. That prize would have taken me back to Egypt a rich man. Instead, thanks to you, they made a galley slave of me. Me! The big man was indignant. Egypt, you're not a Berber, then? Berber be damned. I'm a Mamluk, though I may not look like one dressed in these rags. Soon as we get there, I'm treating myself to a woman, a decent plate of kofta, and a good suit of clothes. Ezio looked around him again, stumbling, then regaining his balance as an unexpected wave chopped aslant the bow. Not much of a seaman, are you? Gondolas are more my line. Gondolas? Pah! If you wanted to kill me... Can you blame me? It was the only reason I hung around in that cesspool of a Venetian port after I'd escaped. I couldn't believe my luck when I saw you. I'd almost given up. I was looking for a way out myself, down there. Ezio grinned. I don't blame you. You chucked me in a tank and left me to drown. You could swim well enough. Any fool could see that. It was the big man's turn to grin. Ah! I might have known I couldn't appeal to your compassion by pretending that I couldn't. You repaid your debt to me. You saved my life. But why did you bring me with you? The big man spread his hands. You were wounded. If I'd left you, they'd have come for you. You wouldn't have lasted the night. And what a waste of my effort that would have been. Besides, you can make yourself useful on this tub, landlubber though you are. I can look after myself. The big man's eyes grew serious. I know you can, Effendi. Maybe I just wanted your company. Ezio Auditore. You know my name. You're famous. Vanquisher of pirates. Not that that would have saved you after killing a team of watchmen and trying to escape. Ezio thought about that. Then he said, What do they call you? The big man drew himself up. His dignity belied the galley slave's rags he still wore. I am Al-Scarab, Scourge of the White Sea. Oh, said Ezio wryly. Pardon me. Temporarily on my back foot, Al-Scarab added ruefully. But not for long. When we get there, I'll have a new ship and crew within a week. When we get where? Didn't I tell you? The nearest port worth anything that's also in Mamluk hands, Acre. 8. The time had come. It was hard to leave, but his mission was imperative, and it called Ezio urgently onward. His time in Acre had been one of rest and recuperation, forcing himself to be patient as his wound healed, for he knew his quest would come to nothing if he were not fully fit for it. And meeting Al-Scarab, disastrous as it would have been if things had gone differently, had shown him that if any guardian angel existed, he had one. The big pirate, whom he had bested in the battle aboard the Anan, had proved himself to be more than just a lifesaver. Al-Scarab had extended family in Acre, and they welcomed Ezio as the rescuer of their cousin and as his brother-in-arms. Al-Scarab said nothing of his defeat in the Anan incident, and enjoined Ezio on pain of unmentionable retribution to follow suit. But the escape from Larnaca was boosted into a fight of epic proportions. There were 50 of them, Al-Scarab would start his story, and the number of perfidious Venetian assailants they'd been obliged to fight off had reached 10 times that number by his 10th telling of the tale. Open-mouthed and wide-eyed, his cousins listened spellbound, and never breathed a word about any of the inconsistencies that crept in. At least, he didn't throw in a sea monster, Ezio thought dryly. One thing that was not invention were the warnings that came from Al-Scarab's family of the dangers Ezio would have to be prepared for in his onward journey. They tried hard to persuade him to take an armed escort with him, but this Ezio steadfastly declined to do. He would ride his own road. He would not subject others to the perils he knew he must face. Soon after his arrival at Acre, Ezio took the opportunity to write a long, overdue letter to his sister. He chose his words with care, conscious that this might be the last time he would ever communicate with her. Acre, 20 November, 1510.
My dearest sister Claudia, I have been in Acre a week now, safe and in high spirits, but prepared for the worst. The men and women who have fed and sheltered me here also gave me warning that the road to Masyaf is overrun by mercenaries and bandits not native to this land. What this could mean, I fear to guess. When I first set out from Roma 10 months ago, I did so with a single purpose, to discover what our father could not. In the letter you know of, written the year before my birth, he makes a single mention of a library hidden beneath the floors of Altaïr's former castle, a sanctum full of invaluable wisdom. But what will I find when I arrive? Who will greet me? A host of eager Templars, as I fear most strongly? Or nothing but the whistling of a cold and lonely wind? Masyaf has not been home to the assassins for almost 300 years now. Does it remember us? Are we still welcome? I am weary of this fight, Claudia. Weary, not because I am tired, but because our struggle seems to move in one direction only, toward chaos. Today, I have more questions than answers. That is why I have come so far, to find clarity, to find the wisdom left behind by the great mentor, so that I may better understand the purpose of our fight and my place in it. Should anything happen to me, dear Claudia, should my skills fail me or my ambition lead me astray, do not seek revenge or retribution in my memory, but fight to continue the search for truth, so that all may benefit.